So right now, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, who will be Vicki Christiansen, the Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Chief Christiansen leads the Forest Service efforts to increase active forest management and deliver landscape conservation through shared stewardship with local, state, and national partners and tribes. She'll be speaking about meeting land management challenges through shared stewardship. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Chief Christiansen.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. You know, I apologize for the technical glitch, and thank you, George. Really is sharing stewardship when you go in my place. So thank you, really appreciate that. And you know, our shared stewardship agreement here in Washington is really central to our partnership with the state. Through shared stewardship, the Forest Service is really working together with the state, with tribes, and all of our other partners to reach really shared goals specific to Washington across our shared landscapes. And we're really excited to visit with you about that today. So I'll give you a broad overview of shared stewardship, where it came from, and where we are today under the new administration. And to help give you an idea of the potential for shared stewardship agreements, I will use an example of a partnership in Colorado, and then I'll end with maybe a brief overview of where we are with shared stewardship in Washington state. So, as you know, sustainable forestry is at the core of who we are at the Forest Service. And our mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. And we share common origins with the Society of American Foresters through the legacy of Gifford Pinchot. And I'm sure everyone at this meeting can identify, with our core purpose. I spent the first 2/3 of my career with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And even with DNR, I always identified with what I considered the nation's mission in regards to our Forest Service mission of sustaining the nation's forest and grasslands. And there's a lot of connections that I think we all have around that core purpose. So really, everything we do is intended to sustain forests and grasslands across the nation on behalf of the people we serve, both now and certainly in generations to come. And, at the Forest Service, we are grounded or anchored to our direct land management responsibility of the 193 million acres of National Forest Service lands. But we also have the world's largest forestry research and development organization. And then, of course, through our state and private forestry mission area, we have broad authorities to work with others, particularly our state partners, to help sustain all 766 million acres of the nation's forests. So really, we talk at the Forest Service that our core purpose is very simple. It's to support nature in sustaining all life. And we do that in collaboration with partners and communities on the nation's forest across these shared landscapes. And our core purpose really involves connecting people to the land and to each other. Many of you have heard me say, those of you that know me, that my personal passion, it's quite simple, but it's connecting people to their natural resources. And the founding fathers of conservation, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, recognized that we could never succeed alone, that we needed partnerships with landowners and communities across shared landscapes, because conservation has always meant sharing stewardship for the natural resources we all depend on for our collective well-being. So it's that same spirit of shared stewardship that has always been a part of the cultural fabric at the Forest Service. We're growing that. We're becoming better at that, I'd like to say. Because one of our core values at the Forest Service is interdependence, because we recognize all the complexities of the entire ecosystem and all the interdependencies of people and communities with the land. And to succeed, we need to find new and innovative ways of working together with partners and communities for the outcomes we all want: healthy, resilient forests and grasslands for people to use and enjoy, whether on public lands or on private lands. So with that said, foresters and conservationists like Gifford Pinchot were not always the humblest of spirits. They took great pride in their accomplishments, and we still do. But we take pride in having reversed the loss of America's forest and protecting a forest legacy that is the envy of the world. We are by far the world's largest producer of wood, and we have an incredible network of private forest lands. And we have a system of public and community lands, state, tribal, federal, county, municipal, that are second to none. And the vast expanses of healthy native forests are the birthright of every American to use and to enjoy. And that is quite an accomplishment, and we can all be proud of it. But with that pride comes humility and the honest admission that we don't know it all. We in the forestry community, in the wildland fire community, we have made mistakes. And you're going to hear from one of our best, Dr. Paul Hesberg, later. And one of the results is the decline in forest health in many parts of the United States, including parts of my home state of Washington. And it took us a while at the Forest Service to acknowledge that we don't know it all and we can't do it all, not all alone. And the challenges we face are just too great. Drought, wildfire, insects and disease, invasive species, the effects of a changing climate. These things cross borders and boundaries, affecting all of us, whether state, private, tribal, or federal. And the rivers and the streams that bind landscapes into watersheds do not define land ownerships. Most watersheds are in multiple ownerships, even in the West. And because we share watersheds, we face the same challenges across shared landscapes. We really are all in this together. So beginning in the last century, with the rise of ecosystem-based approaches to land management, we came to understand that we need to work together across shared landscapes if we're ever to rise to the challenges we face. And as we came together to discuss land management issues on a watershed scale, we planted the seeds of shared stewardship. The Forest Service began working more with many of you through partnerships and collaboration. And now partnerships and collaboration are part of our cultural DNA. It's just how we get things done. There's the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Projects, Joint Chiefs Landscape projects, a robust Good Neighbor Authority agreements that Washington is really leading out on. and other great partnerships examples in the Pacific Northwest. So in 2009, the Forest Service embraced this landscape scale conservation through partnerships and collaboration as the foundation for our national policy. And also that year, the new Secretary of Agriculture endorsed the same approach, calling it all lands, all hands. And yes, folks, that was Secretary Tom Vilsack, the same agriculture secretary we have today. So landscape scale conservation, all lands, all hands, shared stewardship, call it what you will, it comes down to this. I'll say it again, we are all in this together. So the 2018 Farm Bill led us to taking the next step. The Farm Bill came with a fire funding fix for the Forest Service and the Department of Interior, and it decoupled our rising fire management costs from the rest of our conservation and natural resource budgets and our partnership obligations. But Congress asked us for something in exchange. Some step we could take ourselves at the Forest Service to help the nation come to grip with the scale of the wildland fire challenges that we face. In fact, folks, it was on a hearing in June 4th, I remember the date, in front of the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee, and Senator Wyden from Oregon said, "Chief, now that you have this fire funding fix, will you give me a plan that's going to get after the backlog of all these hazardous fuels?" Thinking it was a simple plan. Well, we sat down together and we took stock of our science and our capacity for partnership. And we realized that we had an opportunity in the collaboration with our partners to really up our game on how we could shift the trajectory of these fire sheds. Because in recent decades, we have acquired unprecedented capacity for building shared stewardship across our broad landscapes. And we have practice and we are gained experience in working through our partnerships and our landscape scale restoration projects, using tools like thinning, prescribed burning across landscapes in multiple ownerships. And that has given us the experience we need to lay the foundation for new partnerships and stakeholders across our shared landscapes to achieve shared goals. So through the state foresters, we have always had great relationships with the states, and we knew that the states could take the lead to up the scale from the very local level. And as you know, the states have forest action plans, and we can use those to coordinate fuels and forest health treatments across our planning areas that span our jurisdictional boundaries. So the states are also uniquely positioned to convene stakeholders across our landscapes to evaluate the wildland fire environment, to agree on cross-jurisdictional planning areas, and to assess fire risks and alternatives for managing the risk, and then to set the priorities for investments for all of us that will bring the most bang for the buck. We called it an outcome-based investment strategy instead of just outputs. And we launched it in August of 2018. It was June in 2018 when the Senate called for a plan. And in August, together, George Geisler was at the Capitol with myself and former Secretary of Agriculture Perdue, and Senator Wyden and Senator Cantwell, Senator Daines of Montana, and Senator Murkowski of Alaska. And it's better known as the Shared Stewardship Initiative because shared stewardship is really at the core. shared stewardship is different from what we have built on in the past and what we have done in the past in 3 ways. And let me just briefly describe those. First, it elevates planning and decision-making from the national forest level, if you're looking at it from a Forest Service perspective, to the state level. And we propose sharing decision space with governors' offices and state agencies, tribes, and other stakeholders to set the broad priorities together based on the State Forest Action Plan, state wildlife plans, and other tools. Second, it uses new science to do the right work in the right place at the right scale for the outcome we are trying to achieve. Instead of just random acts of restoration, we share the decision space and we place treatments where they can produce desired outcomes at a meaningful scale. And third, it takes full advantage of our capacity for shared stewardship across shared landscapes by using all of our tools and authorities for improving landscape conditions, whether it's good neighbor authority or stewardship contracts or tribal agreements, whether prescribed fire or mechanical thinning or targeted grazing, whether scenario planning or some other tool for placing the right treatments. So through shared stewardship, we are working with the states, tribes, and other partners, including local communities, to choose the most appropriate tools tailored to the local conditions from our full toolbox of tools. So I mentioned scenario planning, and what helped make all this possible is a scientific breakthrough by some of our great Forest Service researchers, a tool called scenario planning, and it truly is a game changer. So scenario planning is based on a suite of tools for understanding a whole range of conditions at landscape scales. And our scientists developed national assessments for wildlife, or for wildfire hazards, for terrestrial conditions, watershed conditions, forest health, and so much more. And these conditions interconnect across broad landscapes, so making investments to achieve outcomes in one area can lead to trade-offs in another. So these tools together give us the ability to better understand the risks, fire risk or other risks, at actual scale. And today's mega fires, we know, can travel for many miles to threaten homes, communities, and other values. And the entire area is called a fire shed. And scientists can now map entire fire sheds, including all federal, state, private, tribal, and other parcels. And it will make up the individual fire shed. We can also map the contribution, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm gonna ignore that. So we can also map the contribution to fire risk from each parcel of land, and we can use that information to forecast what might happen if we put various kinds of treatments here or there. And our scientists have mapped the nation's fire shed and have compiled a fire shed registry. And the fire shed registry combines information about past wildfires and fuels treatments with information about present conditions, like ownership, buildings, fuels, risk across the fire sheds. Based on all of that information, the fire shed registry lets planners project treatment scenarios and model outcomes for decision makers to use for us to use to make our best project investments. So scenario planning really works like this. We use the tools to assess the risk on the fire shed. Then we project scenarios for various management actions, along with the probable outcomes and trade-offs. Then, depending on the outcomes we desire, we set priorities for investing in the corresponding management activities. Because a fire shed is almost always in multiple ownerships, the fire can spill over from any direction, which means that the risk is almost always shared. So it only makes sense to use scenario planning on an all lands basis through shared stewardship across shared landscapes. And scenario planning gives us the ability to assess fire risk across these broad landscapes, to project scenarios for various management actions, and to set priorities for investing in the right management activities at the right scale and in the right place. And the principle of using the right technology in the right place at the right scale is built into many of our shared stewardship agreements with 25 states right now and more coming. So we don't necessarily have to use the fire shed registry or scenario planning for shared stewardship to work, but we can. And we can apply this new technology to meet fire-related challenges with the state taking the lead. Or we can use some other mechanism if that's what the states and stakeholders want. We can also use shared stewardship to meet other kinds of cross-boundary challenges, such as invasive species or outbreaks of insects and disease. Shared stewardship is working with the state, tribes, and other partners to set broad priorities across shared landscapes for the outcomes we all want. Then we can use scenario planning or other mechanisms to come to agreements with communities and stakeholders at the right time, in the right place, at the right scale, with the right tools. And it's rare to see broad national alignment with anything these days, but shared stewardship is one thing that most people seem to agree on. And Washington and Oregon and Idaho were all early signatories. So, as I said, we have 25 agreements, including the entire West Coast and every state in the Rocky Mountain and Intermountain regions. And we've signed agreements with 2 tribal groups, and we've also signed an agreement with the Western Governors Association and 2 regional associations of states. So in total, 47 states and 3 territories have signed on. And as you know, we have a new administration in Washington, D.C. The previous administration supported shared stewardship, and it has been known to happen that prior initiatives are jettisoned by an incoming administration. But remember what shared stewardship is about. It's coming together across our shared landscapes to meet common challenges and reach shared goals. And it's a common sense approach that the Forest Service and all of you have been taking decades to build upon. So Secretary Vilsack is fully behind an all lands, all hands approach to federal land management. And shared stewardship enjoys broad bipartisan support. And indeed, shared stewardship might be said to have originated in that exchange that I told you about with Senator Wyden back in June of 2018. So let me give you quickly an example. It comes out of Colorado. It's called the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative, and it came out of discussions that we had with the national leaders at the National Wild Turkey Federation, one of our major partners. We met at the national conference in 2019, and we challenged each other, the CEO, Becky Humphreys, and I, to develop a pilot project in the Western states for increasing the pace and scale of forest restoration in the spirit of shared stewardship. And Colorado became the pilot state. And we followed up by convening about a dozen leaders from across the state who were concerned about the declining forest health and the growing risk from wildfires. And we met with these leaders in Denver in May of 2019, and we agreed that by pooling our resources and focusing on just one landscape, we'd have a better chance of truly making a difference. So by July, more than 30 stakeholders had joined the initiative, including utility providers, state natural resource managers, recreation industry advocates, and many more. And together, they pinpointed some of the most important Colorado landscapes at risk. And they also outlined some potential strategies for building resilience and protecting them. And the stakeholders choose 3 high priority areas across Colorado, and they met with community leaders and organizations in all 3 landscapes. And together they discussed opportunities for making collective investments to reduce risk from wildfires and other disturbances. By then, more than 170 people had gotten involved in the initiative in one way or another. In September, then, it started in May, and in September, the stakeholders met to set a timeline and establish a process for settling on a single project area. And 7 proposals came forward, and in December, the decision was made. The initial project area encompasses nearly 750,000 acres in southwestern Colorado, stretching 120 miles along a major highway. And it includes several towns along the San Juan National Forest and a national park. And the project area certainly includes rivers, reservoirs, and tourist attractions, along with the entire water supply for the tribal reservation. And each stakeholder organization will decide what to contribute towards achieving the project's restoration goals. And the stakeholders started working with the local project team to plan the first projects using all available tools, from timber sales to prescribed fire. And the goal is to find the right place to do the right work in the right scale at the right time. You know, together the partners formulated 10-year goals in 4 outcome areas, and projects are now underway in Southwest Colorado with some really great initial success. The initiative has since expanded to 2 additional project areas. One is 900,000 acre project in the Upper Arkansas River, and the other is 885,000 acre project on the Upper Platte. And it's truly been a model of shared stewardship, at least the way I always envisioned it. We brought partners and stakeholders together from different places with different interests to make collective decisions about our shared values and our shared landscapes. And we're moving on to decisions about projects and actions that we can take in the same collaborative vein. And it's a great example of what we can do when we bring stakeholders together through shared stewardship to achieve the outcomes we all want across the landscapes we share. So folks, like the Rocky Mountain Restoration Initiative, the various shared stewardship agreements around the country are at various stages of implementation, and they have generated a lot of enthusiasm from Washington to Massachusetts and from Idaho to Georgia. And the various agreements are tailored to individual states and various stakeholders, but they are all based on innovative approaches to conservation and on the recognition that we're all in this together. And the framework for shared stewardship in Washington looks a little different than the one in Colorado, but just as promising. In Washington, the blueprint for implementation is the state's Forest Action Plan and the state's Wildlife Action Plan. And the key is aligning these priorities with the 5-year restoration plans for each of the 5 national forests in the states. So take the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, for example. Stakeholders' goals include increased landscape resilience following wildfire and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And local land managers are working with Washington DNR to share data, analyze large landscapes, and to propose actions on both public and private lands. So in closing, shared stewardship is the culmination of decades of working with each other through partnerships and collaboration with organizations like Society of American Foresters, our state partners, and others. And I envision us continuing to work with the state and other stakeholders across these landscapes through shared stewardship with a laser focus on the people we serve. And I envision a broad, diverse coalition for conservation that brings all stakeholders to the table. And I envision us working across boundaries, leveraging resources with our partners and using all tools and authorities available to us for the benefit of generations to come. Thank you so much. And I look forward to any time we have for Q&A with George.
Thank you very much, Vicki. And we do have a few questions for you. So the first one is regarding the Forest Stewardship Program. So the Forest Stewardship Program is the most important program for small forest landowners. 215,000 owners controlling 5.8 million acres in the state of Washington, for example. This program provides technical, educational, and sometimes financial assistance. Do you see changes in state and private forestry that can help us prepare for implementation if needed?
Well, thank you for that question. I'm not sure what changes were being referenced to, but I'll put the elephant in the room. More financial resources, I would guess, might be the source of the changes. And yes, I mean, to be honest with you, when we got the fire funding fix, we have to think in several realms at the Forest Service. As I said to our folks, we have to do our own fire funding fix. We have to show that we can get things done and we are a good investment. And, you know, I talked about humility in my comments, and this is really coming from a humble approach. It isn't all about the national forest, folks. When fire is being transmitted off the national forest, yes, it often is about the national forest, but the concept of shared stewardship is just that. And it's that everyone has the right seat at the table and the right resources to make a difference. So with that said, our fire funding fix is showing that we are making good our decision quality on fire, and we have accountability on fire so that we can show that to get ahead of this escalating challenge in this nation, we need to address all landowners' needs. So with that said, with the acceptance and to, quite frankly, all the way to the enthusiasm of a shared stewardship model, we have the platform to say, we can't leave any landowners behind. And particularly with this administration's priorities on climate change and equity for all folks, we have even more rationale to say our state and our local partners and our private lands bring incredible resource benefits for the there's public benefits. I mean, as long as public benefits flow from private lands, there is a role for the federal government to contribute to keeping those forests healthy and resilient, and keeping them as forests. All of that to say, it's congressional decision what the budgets we get, but I feel very confident that we are well positioned for more opportunity in the very important stewardship program for the 11 million family forest landowners in this nation. And George might have something to add more specifically. I used to know the number of stewardship plans we had, something like 2,500 when I left, George. You probably upped the game quite a bit.
Oh, yes, we have. And, we're now well over 5,000 and still going. Now, the one piece I wanted to bring on board is that, when we talk about forest stewardship, obviously it is a federal program, part of state and private forestry. But within DNR, we're really trying to embrace what forest stewardship program is. And in fact, bringing additional state funding that can be leveraged within that program as part of our vision for the long-term help and assistance that we provide to small forest landowners. It's no use to just try to reinvent the wheel. So looking at how we address all of these small forest landowners, especially those on the west side, that the capacity that we as an agency and partners have had to address those needs is something that is just needed to truly have the impact on the land that we want to. But again, I popped on because I wanted to emphasize the fact that it truly is that foundational principle that we're using, a foundational program that we're using, and the idea of just getting more resources into that, more availability for small forest land.
Thanks to both of you. And you might both want to address the next question also. So to date, Washington's adaptive management program has not addressed the forest practices rules through the lens of forest health. Given our climate change expectations, how does management of riparian forests fit into the management of upland forests within firesheds? Are there shared stewardship responsibilities that can benefit from investigating more flexibility in riparian forest management?
Yeah, great question there, Jenny. Now, it's been 12 years since I chaired the Forest Practice Board, and so keeping up on Washington's adaptive management program, I have not done. But the point at the rest of your question is we're managing whole functioning ecosystems. And so just to give a little bit of a shout out about scenario planning, we can project. I mean, there's multiple things we want to project for. We want to project for wildfire risks. We want to prevent, and that would be, forest health and resiliency in the forest, for carbon storage, for watershed and watershed benefits. And scenario investment planning, I just named a few, can help us say, we want these kinds of outcomes, and where are the risks and where are they going? So what is it going to take on the landscape? So we have scientific capacity. Now then we'd have to overlay that in Washington State. That's where I toss it to George. Okay, how do you bring some of that science to bear in? I am familiar enough with the forest practice adaptive management to say, we have an adaptation to bring into this with new information. So with that said, I would take the shared stewardship model, and what we try to say about shared stewardship, it's both a way of being, how we are with each other, but it's a way of doing. So the science and the knowledge and the capacity to think in innovative ways and to do things different, but it's also about the way we are in our relationships. So in the doing, I think shared stewardship ethos of this new information to work its way into, I remember many of those adaptive management meetings that could inform these forest health questions. George, what would you add to that?
Well, I think you hit it on, the idea of we have all of this science that is being generated, and we are trying to look at things, I won't say differently. I mean, I think that as foresters, we have always looked at ecosystem resilience and wanted to ensure that what we were doing on the landscape was sustainable. And I think that what forest health, the analysis and the work that's being done related to our our current situation in the forest, the wildland fire impacts, what it's causing us to do, and what shared stewardship allows us to do is to take and recognize that science and really starting to communicate it on a much broader basis because of all the partnerships that are there. You know, when people have started, I've heard this from a number of folks about the forest practices and how are we going to look at taking these to the next level with climate change. You know, because there are some guidelines and rules that are even within that if you look at what minimums are in certain areas and in riparian areas, or even out on the landscape, especially in our uplands, you have to ask, is that truly reflective of what's happening within the climate, within our climate change models now? And so we're trying to work, especially having the discussions between a forest health group, state lands, and forest practices within DNR, especially as to what is it that we need to do? How do we use adaptive management going forward so that we can better learn how to ensure that these landscapes are sustainable as well as resilient on the to wildland fire impacts and insect and disease. So I would say shared stewardship is kind of a framework of communication. It's a recognition of the changes and the use of science. And I think it is starting to, I know that we're having those discussions now over how we can utilize that in an adaptive management model going forward. So it is going to have an impact.
Well, thanks to both of you. All right, the next question, I think this is for you, Vicki. How are the environmental review requirements, specifically NEPA, being addressed? The current timelines to include this process can require years to complete.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I'll try to make it short. In the last 4 years, we have gone through an environmental assessment and decision-making overhaul, quite frankly. And there's 3 levels to what we're doing. One is that we look at we share some risks together, quite frankly, and that we have all the way from our planning, our foresters and our planning teams on the ground, all the way through the line officers, that there's alignment about expectations. And in sharing that risk, you know, we haven't always used the right tool for the level of the higher end tool to make sure we had no risk. So, you know, we all know there's environmental assessments, maybe all that was needed, and we did full EISs or those kinds of things. So it's about looking for the right tool and holding those risks together. So I am pushing innovation, and in a responsible way, without innovation, I mean, to have innovation, we do have to accept some risks, because to innovate, we're going to have some misfires, or we're going to have some failures. And it's what we do with those failures, what we do with that learning is what's important. And we have to hold ourselves together and support each other. The second is just more training and awareness about what it really takes to have a good scientifically based decision. It doesn't, you know, it's not the amount of pages, it's what is the content. And then the third area is taking some inefficiencies out of our regulations. And those are a bit in of a pause. But, you know, where we did very similar analysis for a very similar action, we can use that analysis for an action in a nearby vicinity. There's many more examples than that, but those are all things from our cultural to our actual structural requirements. And that in this bit about working big, thinking big, that we apply our tools on a much broader basis. But you know, folks, we have quite a few projects that are ready to go that have the environmental review and assessment. We just need quite frankly, more resources to be able to execute them on the ground. We always have to continue to get better on our environmental assessment and decision making. And, you know, like in California, they're combining SEPA with NEPA, their state environmental. If we've done reviews, then that counts for the environmental review across the boundary. So there's other benefits of shared stewardship of how we can really work together across these landscapes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Vicki. We are a little bit ahead of time, so we have time for a few more questions, but I don't see any here. So, so it's our next item on the agenda would be a 10-minute break.
Thanks for your flexibility on the technology, folks, and thanks so much for inviting me in. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure and to have you here, Chief Christiansen. Thank you so much. And you too, George. Thank you so much for being here. You make a great team in discussing shared stewardship.
Thank you.
Thank you.